Greetings, sisters and brothers, friends, comrades, colleagues. This is Milton Alimadi. I teach African history at John Jay at the City University of New York system, and I also teach journalism at the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University as an adjunct assistant professor. Today, I would like to speak on the issue of race, class, and capitalism. And it's an issue that is always relevant in conversations on global issues, and it's a issue that is always perennial and has always stood the test of time and history. So often the question is posed, what is much more important? Is it the issue of class? Is it the issue of race? Is it the issue of capitalism? And of course, you cannot isolate any of these issues at all if you look at it historically. So for example, the late Eric Williams, the author of Capitalism and Slavery, which is a book that is a must-read, even though it was published originally in 1944. And of course, Eric Williams later on became the first leader of post-colonial Trinidad and Tobago. So his argument was that racism became much more prominent later, after the beginning of the expansion of global capitalism. In fact, pre-global capitalism. Because first of all, it was the expansion of plantation economy, where the surplus was extracted by exploiting the labor of enslaved Africans. Initially, as the British colonial plantation owning class expanded their operations in the Caribbean, at the early stages, fellow Europeans were even emptied from the jails or kidnapped from the streets of London and taken to work on the plantations. So exploiting surplus from the labor of fellow Europeans, with of course the principal motive being to maximize the extraction of profit. It was at a later stage, Eric Williams argued, when it was discovered that African labor was much more productive, much more efficient, not only for the physical attributes, but the technical attributes as well. Africans were very advanced farmers in terms of using scientific methods, way, way, way before even many European countries existed. You know, they knew how to rotate the soil, not to plant on the same soil repeatedly every year. Some knew of slope terraced irrigation and farming. So they were very advanced, skilled farmers. So of course, they became much more desirable. And hence, the expansion of slavery and enslaving Africans to replace inefficient European labor on the plantations. So of course, now that you need to rationalize the exclusive use of African labor, so now you have to develop the narrative of white supremacy. And the converse of that is African or black inferiority. And that's where the narrative of African savagery, backwardness, all that propaganda started being produced and created to justify and rationalize the brutal, inhumane exploitation of the Africans in order to extract and maximize the extraction of surplus from their labor. So that's his position. His position is very similar to subsequently Walter Rodney's as well. The late Walter Rodney, who of course is the author of the famous book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And in fact, in a very interesting lecture that he gave in 1979 at Columbia University, which in fact is one of my favorite lectures, it's on YouTube under the headline Race and Class in Guyanese Politics. I highly recommend that. And he makes the same argument that even though racism existed prior to the expansion of global capitalism, it was during the expansion of global capitalism that racism became institutionalized. It became a feature of the production system, the mode of production under capitalism. So it was based on race that your access to resources was assigned, your role in the production system, whether you are the owner of capital, whether you are the manager, whether you are the laborer, whether you are the driver, as in the old days when it was from the slave driver on the plantations. So what role you played in the economic system, it became codified depending on what your race was. And of course, the Europeans, who were the drivers of the expansion of global capitalism, were always on the top level, the top rung of the production system. And of course, this same rationalization of black inferiority and white superiority was played out during the era of colonization of non-European parts of the world, including the African continent, of course. And it was the rationalization when Europeans met at the Berlin Conference of 1884, November 1884 to February 1885, under Otto von Bismarck in Germany. They were supposedly gathered there to decide how to partition the African continent so that they could go there and quote-unquote civilize these African heathens and savages. And it was just by coincidence, of course, that those heathens also happened to be in possession of very fertile land with many of the resources that Europe wanted to expand their capitalist production system after industrialization had started in the previous century. So race, class, and capitalism have always moved hand in hand. In fact, as I say in my book, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media, I say racism was the handmaiden of capitalism. And of course, class plays the role in the sense that the drivers of expansion of global capitalism were the ruling class in the European countries that expanded to other parts of the world. So now, and of course, that still pretty much determines the nature of the relationship between African countries and the industrialized European parts of the world. Africans are still seen as inferior to Europeans, relative to Europeans. And that is the guiding, whether obviously we don't have it as explicitly said, although sometimes once in a while it emerges in the literature and in the conversation, but it's not as explicit as during the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. The propaganda is a little more refined nowadays. The propaganda is not as outrageous as it used to be in the past. I remember even in the last, I would say 20 years alone, the use and depiction of African societies as quote-unquote tribal, well, it's still there, it's not as pronounced as it was about 20 years ago. And I've noticed that because, of course, that's something I studied very closely as I was writing my book, Manufacturing Hate. So now that I've discussed some of the history and the historical view and perception of Africans, as in order to, of course, always remember at the end of the day, it is to justify exploitation and extraction of wealth, extraction of surplus from Africa and Africans, and to transfer it to other parts of the world, to Europe primarily, and then, of course, to the United States as well. So let me now focus a little bit on the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. The October 7, 2023 attack by Hamas on Israel and the killing of an estimated 1,200 to 1,400, I think the initial figure was 1,400. I've read an article recently saying perhaps it was downgraded to 1,200. Nevertheless, it's a huge number of people who were killed, and most of them were civilians. And justifiably, the attack has been criticized and condemned as terrorism by Hamas. So that is the one half. But then, in retribution for that attack, we have witnessed for now weeks of indiscriminate bombing of Gaza by the Israeli Air Force. And the question then is, of course, it's come now under a lot of criticism. There's been global condemnation of the ongoing bombing in Gaza. There have been huge protests, including here in the United States, in New York City, and London. In London, there was a huge one a couple of days ago with the estimates of people that turned out ranging anywhere from 800,000 to perhaps even 1 million. So, of course, people are outraged by the bombing of Gaza. But I would like to take this opportunity to also analyze why some aspects of society are actually rationalizing that as acceptable and saying that because of what Hamas did, Israel is justified in bombing civilian buildings, apartment buildings, in bombing schools, in bombing hospitals, in bombing refugee camps. And I think this, for anybody to make that argument and rationalization, I think it's only because Palestinians have been demonized in a particular way, historically. Every attack by Hamas is somehow assigned collective guilt to all Palestinians. And that is even much more effective because Palestinians belong to a certain class, and I don't want to use perhaps even underclass, which is a term I don't even like, number one. Then number two, there's something in particular about being stateless. You see? Something about being permanent refugees. It almost gives the impression that, or perception that, as a stateless people, as permanent refugees, they are somehow much more expendable, less than human beings. So it's not only anti-Arab demonization that is being played out here, but to add upon that, it is the fact that they are stateless, they're basically homeless, they're basically permanent refugees. So it makes their targeting somehow conceptually to some people much more acceptable. And so let me give an analogy or example. I think if Israel was engaged in war, and this is of course just a theoretical situation between Israel and Egypt, I don't think it would be acceptable. And of course, I'm not saying that bombing of Gaza is acceptable, but the people who find it at least acceptable or they can rationalize it, I think it would be much more difficult for the same people to make a similar rationalization if the conflict was between Israel and Egypt and the Israeli Air Force was bombing civilian targets, high rises in any Egyptian city or in Cairo in that theoretical conflict. Because the Egyptians, they have a state, the state of Egypt. They are Egyptians. Or let's even say if the conflict was between Israel and Saudi Arabia, of course the politics make that unlikely. But I'm just drawing this analogy to get us to think, why is it for some segments of the global community to somehow find it tolerable that civilian targets in Gaza could count as collateral damage in this pursuit of Hamas by the Israeli Air Force? And to me, it comes back not only to anti-Arab demonization, but beyond that, it's the class issue here. The state of statelessness, the state of being permanent refugees, lends itself to seeing them by some people as much more expendable than Egyptians, more expendable than Saudis, for example, even though they are all Arab. So that, in fact, is a stronger point and argument for the necessity to have a two-state solution, to have a Palestinian state. Future disputes, future issues, future conflicts would be dealt on a state-by-state basis, but not on a state versus permanent refugees basis. In fact, we probably would not see the type of conflict that we are seeing today if there was a Palestinian state side by side with the state of Israel. So those are the comments I wanted to make today. I want people to think about the intersections, the tie-ins of race, class, capitalism. And of course, one other interesting point actually I'd like to make. When it comes to the Middle East, the United States, of course, is not an even-handed broker anymore. And I was listening to a lecture, or perhaps it was an interview, by Noam Chomsky, who actually said prior to 1967, the U.S. position was much more balanced. But after Israel conquered the territories after the 67 war, the United States started seeing Israel as a way to extend U.S. imperialism in the region and to dominate that oil region. So at the end, it still comes back to capitalism and resources once again. All the tie-ins that I started this conversation with. Now, what will make the U.S. back off a little and become or join the countries that want to be neutral brokers? That is anybody's say. But I think the massive numbers of people that are showing up to protest the current bombing, it's quite possible that once the current conflict comes to a halt, I find it very difficult to see how there's not going to be a momentum, a strong push to finally get toward that two-state solution and have any future issues dealt with on a state versus another state, a nation versus another nation basis. The current imbalance of a nation versus permanent refugees is why we're seeing the one-sided escalation of this conflict today. So thank you, sisters and brothers. Talk to you again soon. You can reach me at malimadi@gmail.com if you're interested. That's MALLIMADI@gmail.com.